Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Robin Pacific, and she is an author, and she's written a really interesting book called Skater Girl. It's a collection of intensely personal essays and archaeology of the self. Robin's work has spanned 30 years in a wide variety of media. In addition to writing personal and critical essays, she has produced artworks in a variety of media encompassing painting, drawing, video installations, performance, and numerous community-based collaborations. In 2012, Robin completed a diploma in spiritual direction at Regis College in the Toronto School of Theology and now practices spiritual direction 1 day a week. She holds a PhD in English literature from York University and a master's in theological studies from Regis College. She is currently enrolled in the University of King's College, Masters of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction. Skater Girl is her first-length book. Wow. Welcome to the show, Robin.
Thank you.
And so Skater Girl, as we mentioned, I apologize. Why don't you tell us about it? What is Skater Girl about?
Well, it's about a lot of different things. First of all, that intro is a little out of date. I completed that Master's in Fine Arts at King's College in 2021. So I now have 5 post-secondary degrees.
5 post-secondary degrees.
And friends, I just love studying, and friends have threatened to do an intervention if I plan on getting any more. So
okay, so what are the 5?
BA, MA, PhD, Masters in Theological Studies, and Masters of Fine Arts.
And the PhD is in?
English literature.
English literature from York University. What was your thesis on?
My thesis was on political theater. I looked at ways in which various individuals and groups of people, collectives, wanted to make theater an agent for social change.
Really, that sounds fascinating. I went to see part 1 of The Inheritance. I'm not sure if you've heard about this at all. I'm going to part 2. It is one of the most powerful plays I've seen, and really does put one far more in touch with the gay community, the gay history, and AIDS, unlike any other experience or thing I've read in the past. So I think you're right that art is a way of really grabbing people's attention.
I saw The Inheritance. I saw both parts. I think it's some of the finest theater I've ever seen in my life. And I lived through that period. I had friends who died of AIDS. And it was incredibly powerful. It was wonderful writing, acting, directing. Even the sound design was wonderful in that show. I really, really liked it a lot.
So tell me about Skater Girl. It's a collection of personal essays and archaeology of the self?
Well, I describe it as sifting through the midden of consciousness. You know, a midden is an archaeological site. It's actually a garbage dump.
Okay.
That has ossified over time, and that people can find, by digging in middens, people find clues as to how people lived. And
themes of art, spirituality, and social justice run like a current through otherwise disconnected pieces and fragments, many as short as 1 paragraph. Really?
Really? Mm-hmm.
How do you do that?
Well, here, I'll give you a sample paragraph. I can pretty much do it from memory. When I was around 15, my parents went out to an event at their golf course, and they came home at about midnight. I was asleep, and they burst into my room, and my mother's face was covered with bruises. And my mother said, you see what your father did to me? And my father said, you see what your mother made me do? And later, I went down to the kitchen. We had, of course, had 1 landline then, and called my older sister, who was recently married, and told her what had happened. And she said, never mind, Robin, you'll write about this one day.
Never mind, Robin, you'll write about this one day.
Yeah, which is, of course, is what I'm doing.
What did you write about?
That was it. That was the story.
So are both right?
Yes. Yes, they both were right. My mother could drive anyone to anything. She was an alcoholic, and she was a very, very belligerent, angry, frustrated woman. And in later years, I've come to see why. You know, she was brilliant, she was gifted, she was talented, and she was stuck being a 50s housewife, which she hated. While my father went out and kind of conquered the world.
Are they still alive?
No, no, not for a long time.
What would they think if they read that passage?
I have no idea. I have an older brother and sister, and they still haven't read the book. I showed them earlier essays, particularly the ones about our parents, and they had different memories or didn't recall what I was recalling. But that's the thing about memory. It's really unreliable.
You have a great involvement in theology and spirituality. Tell me, what's the difference between religion or theology and spirituality?
Well, I don't know. I suppose religion has a set of practices that are, it has rituals and it has a kind of scaffolding of a particular belief system. And spirituality is more generally understood in our times. It's you go out into nature and you feel this wonderful sense of being part of something bigger than you are. That's spirituality. But it's also a religious experience. I don't make much track of the difference between the two words.
Lots of people do, though, seem to think that spirituality is this new age woo-woo stuff that doesn't have anything to do with going to church on Sunday.
Well, in some ways it doesn't. I think because, I do go to church and I am, among all the white-haired other people in church, like younger people have left the ship for sure, often with quite bitter feelings about it. And yet everybody has spirituality. It's like everybody has sexuality. Some people have a high sexual drive, some people have a low, but everyone has spirituality. The members of my immediate family are not in any way, shape, or form spiritual. My parents were atheists. So it was unconventional to grow up in the 1950s and 60s in an atheist household. My father was an assimilated Jew, and my mother was a very angry, lapsed Catholic. So I had no language for the feelings that I had, even from early childhood, which were a kind of yearning, but I didn't know how to articulate it at the time. So then I began by doing a kind of search of New Age spirituality. I was very into that for a number of years. In fact, I spent time, 4 years, living in Big Sur, California, which is the epicenter of all things New Age, Alan Watts and Baba Ram Dass and all those people. And but I just found it didn't have any intellectual rigor for me. It didn't have any, and now so many New Age people are alt-right. Like it's very scary.
Really,
Just
new age spiritual people are now alt-right.
yes, it's a big trend in the US. And Hitler was into, all these things, um, astrology and tarot card readings and Ouija board, all that stuff. Um, yeah. And now it's not everybody for sure. And I still know people who I respect and admire very much who are not that way in any shape or form, but a lot of people have. Yeah, people doing yoga.
You completed this diploma in spiritual direction, and now it says you practice spiritual direction 1 day a week. What the heck is spiritual direction?
Everybody wants to ask that question. Um, well, if you perceive yourself to be on a spiritual path, regardless of what that is or what that might look like, I'm simply here to be your compassionate witness. I might see some signposts on that path that you might not see. I might point it out, but basically it's to be a compassionate witness and listener. So I see about 6 people. Half of them are churchgoers and half are not. One is almost an atheist.
And you
That's
see them, I apologize, and they just talk,
yep, yep.
and you what? You're a therapist, or you're an advisor, you're a spiritual direction person, or what?
I'm not an advisor and I'm not a therapist. I'm a listener. My role is to be a compassionate listener. And
And
sometimes I'll point things out like a therapist does, but I'm not qualified as a therapist, but I might see a kind of through line or see little points of convergence, and I might point those out. But mostly I'm just there to listen.
And people come to you because they want a listener or they want a spiritual advisor or what?
A bit of both, I guess. Yeah.
As you said, half of these people are what? Are
Churchgoers and half are not.
churchgoers. Half are churchgoers and half are not. And they
Yeah.
just want some spiritual guidance. Well, that's interesting. Um, and you talk about all this in Skater Girl?
I don't talk about spiritual direction because it's so confidential. So to tell, I'm telling stories throughout the book that are very personal, but I can't tell those stories because it's completely confidential. So I don't talk about it in the book. I do talk about my quote unquote conversion to Christianity and how shocking that was to me because I'd been an atheist. I was practically a fundamentalist atheist. For years I sat on art juries, and if I saw an art application that had any indication that it was Christian or coming from a religious point of view, ding, I criticized it.
So why did you become converted to Christianity?
I guess I had a couple of profound religious experiences after my husband died, and we had found this counselor at Princess Margaret who happened to be an openly gay Anglican priest. And he was the most humble, wise, lovely man I've practically ever known. And so after my husband Terry died in 2006, 2003, I started going to Douglas's church just because I wanted more of him. Like he led Terry's service and he counseled me when I was in the outer reaches of grief, which lasted a few years, actually lasted 7 years. And so I started going to his church, and here I find myself in this little Anglican church in the heart of the Orthodox Jewish community at Bathurst and Lawrence. And it's a very small congregation, and they're very progressive politically. They've removed everything they possibly can get away with from the diocese, from the bishop, from the liturgy. They didn't say the things that people typically do in a liturgy. They say the creed. They didn't say the creed. It's a lot of instances like that might seem arcane to you, but they were very progressive and they welcomed me with open arms, and I found a spiritual home. Eventually that church died because it just couldn't sustain itself on such a small membership. And that was very sad. But since then I've gone to other churches.
And where's the priest now?
He's retired.
Sounds like he was very spiritual.
Absolutely. And humble. Like he just had a profound humility. He was the chaplain at Casey House during the AIDS crisis. In 1 year, he led 75 funerals.
Oh my God.
So he knew how to walk people who were dying. And he was wonderful with Terry.
I've got to ask you, in that inheritance at the end of part one, when they all come up on stage, are they actors or are they just people from the audience? You know?
They're not from the audience, but they're not actors. I'm guessing that they are people who volunteered to do that.
What
And it was rehearsed.
powerful, powerful, powerful part of the show.
Yeah.
We're going to take a break and come back in just 2 minutes with Robin Pacific, author of a book called The Skater Girl. She's got 5 postgraduate degrees. She's an amazing, interesting individual. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Robin Pacific. She is an author, and she's written a book called Skater Girl. Skater Girl is a collection of intensely personal essays and archaeology of the self. It's got themes of art, spirituality, and social justice, aging, loss, mortality. And it's really about many different selves individuals can have, about creativity, about spiritual seeking, and the dream of a more equal society. Robin, I have a dream of an equal society, but it seems so far away. Why is that?
Look around, right? I mean, the state of the world is dire and it's getting worse daily. I don't need to list, climate apocalypse, the drift to the rabid right in so many countries, including our own, wealth inequality that is getting, more extreme by the day. It's very frightening, our world, very frightening. And if you, as we do, follow the media, it's just doom and gloom and doom and gloom. I think, however, that on the ground, there's a great deal of activity and activism and resistance going on. I mean, if you look at, just to take one example, Stacey Abrams in the state of Georgia, she really organized and she got the vote out. And she almost won, but it was all this grassroots activity going on. And I think that's happening everywhere. We just don't hear about it. So
Sorry, go on.
that gives me a lot of hope. And I also, in one of the essays, I talk about an experience I had twice, 10 years apart, looking at Mark Rothko's paintings in the Tate Gallery in London and trying to articulate the feelings that those paintings brought up in me. And it was a sense of boundarylessness and just a place of no limits. And there was such a feeling of joy. And I believe that that feeling of joy that we experience is a kind of resistance, just like mocking and sarcasm and humor, making fun of Donald Trump. Those are forms of resistance. But in our own inner lives, if we can experience happiness and joy, acknowledging at the same time our immense privilege, I'm a white, cisgendered, well-off woman, it can be an act of resistance. It can be hope is an act of resistance, courage, optimism.
How does your book address social justice?
Well, I tell a couple of funny stories. I was, back in the days when I was a campus radical, I decided by reading, Marx and Engels and Lenin and Mao, and that you can't make a revolution without a revolutionary party. So I kind of put the word out that I was looking for a party to join. So they came swarming. I described myself as being low-hanging political fruit. So I was invited by the Maoists. These were called the Communist Party of Canada, Marxist-Leninists. And they followed the line of Mao Zedong. And I don't know if anyone remembers this, but they used to wave these little red books around that were the sayings of Mao. It was bizarre. They invited me to speak at their lunchtime speaker series. So I agreed, and I went to this room. There were maybe 20 people there. And I got up and I started to talk about Frantz Fanon, who wrote a brilliant book called Blackface, White Masks, and was an Algerian doctor who was a very influential left-wing thinker and brilliant. And I started talking about him. And apparently he was not in the canon, the approved canon of the Maoists. And to a person, they leapt to their feet, waved their little red books in the air, and denounced me, yelling that I was a bourgeois feminist, that I was a comprador, all these things, right? Their invited speaker, the person they invited to speak, they stood up and denounced. So I didn't end up being a Maoist. But yeah, but I talked about, for all the craziness, I wanted to believe in something bigger than myself. I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself. And I think that's a profoundly spiritual want.
Desired. Why the title Skater Girl?
Because there's an essay called Skater Girl, and it's the second essay, and the second to the last essay is also about skating. One is about skating as an 8-year-old, one is about skating as an 80-year-old.
Can you read something more from the book for us, please?
I will. This is just a funny story, but it's a 3.5-minute read. It's from the essay Up on Cypress Street, which is the street I grew up in Vancouver. And I had a friend named Beady Blankenburn. Beady Blankenburn, so called because she had small beady eyes, was the youngest of 4 girls. Her older sisters all sewed their own clothes on the dining room table. Mr. Blankenburn came home for lunch every weekday, so the dresses in making, the sewing machine, the ironing board, and all the sewing paraphernalia were swept away to make room for a white linen tablecloth, washed and ironed by Mrs. Blankenburn, or one of the three older daughters, white linen napkins, the good silver, and the good china. After lunch, this would all also be taken away, and sewing would recommence. Why don't they just eat lunch at the kitchen table like we do, I thought. Save all the good linen, silver, and china for Sunday dinner. They were all great cooks and bakers, the Blankenburn girls, and it was Beatty who taught me how to make cupcakes. Like Sybil Waldorf, she felt a need to take over my religious education. My assimilated Jewish father and my lapsed Catholic mother were great skeptics and atheists, which troubled Beatty's little Anglican heart. She dragged me to a church group for girls called Explorers, which met at St. Mary's Anglican Church on 37th and Larch in Vancouver. We had to wear middies, which were vaguely like sailor suit tops, and berets. At one meeting, it was announced that there was to be an explorer rally, a jamboree, in New Westminster. Notices were sent home. Every girl must have an ironed middy and wear her hat. There were about 300 girls in that rally, about 209 of whom remembered to bring their beret. The explorers decided to have a bake sale and contest for Christmas, and we were all instructed to bake a cake. The only rule was that it had to be made from scratch. Since my last name was Bell, I decided I would make a cake in the shape of a bell, perfect for Christmas. I was on fire with this vision. I rushed home from school and baked my cake from scratch, and then began to cut it into the shape of a bell. One side looked different, so I cut it again. And then that side didn't look right. And then there was just this skinny cake that looked like nothing at all. I was desolate. We had to be there with our cake at 5 o'clock. I had let down the side, and Beatty's frowning face would be there to remind me. My mother, who for once had some clue about what was going on with me, was actually very nice and helpful, which is perhaps one reason I remember this story so clearly. Take this, she said, handing me a few dollar bills. Run down to the store and get a cake mix and buy one of those cans of prepared icing. No one will ever know the difference. Square cake was baked on time, and I iced it and decorated it with a Christmas tree. The boughs were made out of sparkly green sugar, the trunk was chocolate sprinkles, and the decorations were tiny red gumdrops. I skulked off to St. Mary's, put the cake in the back row, and sat down beside Beatty. The cakes were lined up on benches that had been dragged up in front of the altar. We children and our parents sat in the pew. My mother was not in attendance. She scorned any event for children, as well as any cafe clutches with other housewives, preferring to stay home reading and smoking one DeMaurier cigarette after another. To my great consternation, my cake won first prize and was auctioned off at the highest bid. And of course, Mrs. Blankenburn bought it. Every day that week, Beatty brought a slice of it in her lunch. This cake is so good, she would say, looking at me suspiciously with her beady eyes. Did she know I hadn't baked it from scratch? I never asked, and she never told.
Very cute story. With your upbringing that seems kind of a little bit different, how did you grow this incredible desire for social justice?
That's a very good question. I think that, I was at university in graduate school when all the foment was happening, the anti-war movements, the beginning of the second wave of feminism, and so on. And I don't remember quite why I did this, but for some reason I read the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels. And the opening sentence, there is a specter haunting Europe, and that specter is communism. And everything solid melts into air. And for the first time in my chaotic inner life, the world cohered. It made sense. There was a plan. Marx was the man with the plan, and I was going to follow it. And it was revelatory, because suddenly history made sense. It wasn't just a set of chaotic events. There was feudalism, and feudalism led to capitalism, and capitalism inevitably, or so we believed, would lead to socialism. There was a momentum, an upward momentum in human history. I don't know if I still believe that, But I certainly believed it as a young woman, and it galvanized me for 10 years.
So you were a Marxist in university.
I still am a Marxist.
Really fascinating. And yet you're also an Anglican
Yeah, yeah.
and a spiritual therapist,
Director, not a therapist.
spiritual director.
Yeah.
Um, what do you think of our world today? What do you think of feminism today? You know, with the demise of Roe v. Wade, with this 1824 law in Arizona, with abortion rights seemingly being discarded, if not, frankly, laws written against them across the United States, with alt-right that you talked about, with fascism or at least authoritarianism, in so many places around the world. The world, even communist countries, seem to be going the opposite direction.
They do. I'll just speak briefly to feminism. I think that it's going to lose Trump the election, the abortion stuff. I think too many women are against it. And when they've had referenda and when they've had um, uh, state elections for governor or senator or whatever, the right wing, the candidates Trump endorsed have lost. And that's the reason. Now, I think it's he's leading in every poll. So Hillary Clinton was leading in every poll when she lost. So, what can we do but hope? But I think women are organizing. They're organizing underground ways of getting women abortions if they need them, and learning how to perform early term abortions themselves. It's not that difficult. And that gives me hope. Yeah. Yeah, we can't lose sight of that because it's so easy to fall into despair right now.
How do you feel about what's going on in Eastern Europe or the Middle East?
It's just a bloodbath. It's awful. It's so horrible. I think that whatever our views are about it, and our views are varied for sure. I do believe that there's genocide going on in Gaza. I think we are all suffering a trauma because of it. We might not talk about it. I know I bring it up with the people that I do spiritual direction with. I say, do you want to talk about it? Because whether we're talking about it or not, we're traumatized by it.
Traumatized by the death in Gaza.
Yeah, and in Ukraine, and in Somalia, and in, um, the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where they have these, private armies, and now, private armies are fighting private armies. And, there was a sense at one point, particularly during the Second World War, that, you were fighting for a set of values that your country represented. That's no longer the case. It's become so tribalized, and death has become so normalized in so many places.
So your father was Jewish, so you're arguably half Jewish. How do you reconcile what happened on October the 7th and what Hamas did with your attitudes toward what you call a genocide in Gaza?
You can't reconcile it. You can't reconcile it. Of course, it was unbelievably horrific and cynical because they knew what the outcome would be. Hamas knew perfectly well that it would wreak down horrific havoc on innocent Palestinians. So basically, I think there's two theocratic fascist rulers who are holding millions of people, both in Israel and in Gaza and in the East Bank, hostage to their crazy shit. That's what I think.
Two theocratic fascist rulers.
Yeah, that's what I call Netanyahu. He's a right-wing maniac and um, wants to hold on to power because he was in danger of being, put in jail for corruption. And whoever the leader of Hamas is, it seems to change, but the leadership, let's say, of Hamas, same thing. They're religious fanatics and they are in control and they have weapons and they are murdering innocent people.
you talked about being a Marxist and the evolution of history from feudalism to capitalism to socialism. Um, Putin's invasion of Ukraine seems to almost go back to, I don't know if it's feudalism, but back to the great empires of the past, where it's not really a desire to expand or extend communism, which is what, you know, maybe Brezhnev would have done, but it's imperial empire building, is it not?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And it seems so anachronistic. But again, it's a crazy monomaniacal leader who's driving it.
So in 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, Francis Fukuyama wrote the book or the article about the end of history, and that you know, liberal democracy, free enterprise had won history effectively, and that history was over, because it seemed that communism, in terms of the Soviet Union, not necessarily elsewhere, but at least in the Soviet Union, had died and had been proven uneconomically sustainable. And yet we haven't gone back to communism. We've gone back to something different. How do you, as a English lit historian, you know, person who studied and says that they're Marxists today, understand where we are in history?
It's a tough question. It's a tough question, and I don't think there's a simple answer. I do think that as we speak, there are many progressive political thinkers trying to find or propose alternative economic models. Lenin, who died in 1923, developed something called the NEP, the New Economic Policy, and it was for a mixed economy. It was for some private ownership. It was definitely for democratic elections. And he died, and there was a fight between Stalin and Trotsky, and I think a third person. Stalin won, and he was a utter dictator. It's a very complicated thing because Marx believed that Germany and England were the two countries that could sustain socialism, because he said you needed an educated working class to form the next society. In Russia, 80% of the population were illiterate peasants. There was no infrastructure, there was no industry. So Stalin and under brutally repressive and horrific measures, he industrialized Russia. And then the Second World War destroyed that infrastructure. And he did it again. So it took England 200 years to industrialize, and it took Russia 20 years twice. And, you know, there was tremendous upheaval and repression in England when, you know, the commons were taken over and where children were forced to work and so on. So, you know, I look at this history in a kind of different way.
If people read your book, what do you hope they get out of it? What's the message?
There's no message. I just hope that they enjoy reading it. Some parts are funny, some are sad, that it's about me, that they maybe appreciate that this 78-year-old woman is writing about her life and publishing a book for the first time. Yeah, but the response of readers is not something I have any intention for. I just do the work. Same with artwork. I make the artwork, and it's up to people how they react, how they respond.
Are you going to write a second book?
I don't think so.
One and done.
Kind of. I think so.
Well, you're a fascinating individual. I think I'd love to come and do a spiritual listening session with you, because I bet you've got some interesting things to listen to and say after you listen to them.
Mm-hmm. I'd be honored. That'd be great.
Robin Pacific, if people want to read your book, how do they get it?
Everywhere books are sold, but I really encourage people to go to their independent neighborhood bookstore and ask them to order it. But of course, you can get it on Amazon tomorrow if you want to do that way.
And if people want to access your spiritual listening, how do they do that?
My website, robinpacific.ca.
Robin Pacific, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, me too. Thanks so much.
We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.